on the bus. In a decent society, you wouldn't be ignoring the needs of those people living in bad and overcrowded accommodation. We'd be reaching out to everybody in every part and every community of Britain. So we're running this campaign at one level, yes, for the election of the leader of the party, but it's also about the kind of society we want and reaching out to people to have that discussion. So nearly all the places we go to, we also have a quite long discussion with a random group of people who talk about many things. They talk about the housing crisis that's facing the whole country, and I'll come back to that in a moment. They talk about rights at work and the problems they have of representation, of insecure employment, of 0 hours contracts. They talk about that. They also talk about the way older people are often disrespected and ignored within our society. They also talk about the appalling levels of casual and determined sometimes and deeply nasty, always, racist abuse that takes place so often around this country. Those discussions bring people together. Those discussions, to me, are a good way that you hear people's views, are a good way of founding what ought to be a democratic process for policy making, not just in our party, but also in our unions and in our country itself. The issue has to be how we build a strong, real and meaningful democracy within our society. Tony Benn often told me that you could draw a parallel line of the growth of democracy and democratic accountability with the social advances that were made. I remember him telling me, and we discussed it at great length, the way in which the principles of the English Civil War were actually about the accountability of the then Parliament and holding the then divine right of rule of the King to account of that Parliament. But it also unleashed so many other demands. Questions about land, questions about rights, questions about freedom of assembly and freedom of worship. Much of that was temporarily silenced by the counter-revolution that took place later on. But then you trace from the 19th century onwards the growth of democracy. The Great Reform Act of 1832, built on all the struggles of the hardship and misery at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Only a few years later, we had the first Factories Act through Parliament. Only 30 years after that, we had the principles of universal education. Only 50 years after that, we had the first serious debate about the principles of social security and the kind of inclusive society we would all want to live in. We gained the rights of women to vote because of the hardship of those that laid down their lives in many cases and struggled for the right of women to vote, inspired by earlier great thinkers such as Mary Wollstonecraft and so many others that had that idea that you had to challenge the narrative that was there. So I say that because it is democracy that we're talking about, and it is the principles behind it. We can only develop as a democratic society if all our young people are brought up and grow up understanding where our rights have come from, understanding where our achievements have come from. They were never handed down from above. The NHS was never a gift from the professions or the medical industry. It was something achieved from the ground. So it is about that expression and exertion of democracy. And so there are a number of principles behind this that I want to just let you know about tonight. The first one, the principle of democracy, has to be the ground up. That you listen to what people say, they have a real voice in it, they have their opinions and ideas going forward. I tell you this, how you develop an economic strategy could be done by economists, yes, and there are good economists around who give you some very good ideas. There are also people who work in factories, in call centres, in local authorities, in many other places who also have ideas and are frustrated that nobody is listening to them. Breaking open this sort of magic circle of Westminster, some of our great universities, Whitehall and the boardrooms, who try to control thinking, control ideas and control the way policy is developed. None of this is easy, but surely the principle has to be, in a real democracy, it's not just about voting every 4 or 5 years. It's not just about electing people to public office. It's holding them to account when they are in public office, but having your say at all other times on what policies are going to go forward and be developed. That cabinet ministers and Labour governments have been through in the past, they're often hemmed in by this magic circle of decision-making that prevents ordinary people's views being taken on board, ordinary people absolutely ignored. Decisions taken top-down end up working often for the benefit of the privileged few, not the many. Perhaps we could turn that thing around. We need to have decision-making made for the millions and not the millionaires. That surely would be the right way to do it. So it is about trusting the wisdom of ordinary people to do things differently and do things in a much better way. And so we have to have a more devolved democracy within our society. That devolution has to be, yes, to strong local authorities, yes, to regions and nations, yes, also to citizens' assemblies. But there is a cheap word in all this which has to be challenged, and that is devolved power and all is well. National wealth is not shared equally across regions any more than it's shared equally between people. There has to be a very important and very tough role for central government in ensuring the fair distribution of resources, included with the devolution packages. Otherwise, we end up passing services and responsibilities onto somebody else without the resources to deliver them, and passing on the cuts that don't look as though they're being made by central government, but in reality are. Look at this local authority in Brent, look at every other authority in London, look at them across the country. I've often said this in many places. You could take a map of the poor of Britain and put a red blob over each area of great inequality and great poverty. You could then take a second map of the areas of greatest cuts in central government support to every part of this country and say use blue for the greatest cuts. I tell you what, the blue would obliterate the red. It's the poorest who are paying the price of austerity in the cuts that have been made. So there also has to be transparency in the way that decisions are made. Think, for example, if our health service was more democratically accountable and people were involved, I hate the word ordinary people, but that's one that's often used, were involved in those decisions, because none of us are ordinary, we're all individual, unique and special.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Would any rational person have said that building a new hospital through private finance initiative, or building a new school through private finance initiative, which ends up with an education service and a health service, virtually tenants in what were publicly owned and run buildings, and paying through the nose to companies sometimes that have outsourced their activities to tax havens as a way of funding public service development, would they say that's really a very sensible way of running things?
No.
Most people wouldn't buy a house on a credit card. They would try to get a mortgage at the best interest rate they could. Instead, private finance initiative is a bit like building a new hospital on a credit card, and you don't even own the hospital when you've paid it off. Surely we can and should do things differently. So with real transparency in that decision making, it would be very, very different. Democracy in the economy and economic decision making is also very central to much of this. And I'll come on to this a bit later as well. Democracy means an economy that works for all. It means devolving decision making, but it also means that everyone at work has a right to representation by an independent trade union, a right to organise into a trade union. This isn't magic, far-left extreme stuff. This is actually in the International Labour Organisation Convention, signed, I believe, in 1919. We are in breach of it in this country. So it is about trade union rights. And it's about democracy in our own party and in our own movement. Because we have to be held to account for what we do if we're elected into office in the party. We also have to make sure that every member of the party has their rights, their right to participate, their right to vote, their right to be heard, their right to propose policy, their right to put forward the ideas they want. That is not a weakening of leadership. It's not a weakening of our party. It's not a weakening of our democracy. Nothing could make it stronger than the active participation of the 500,000 people that have joined us. New members in 1 year, leading to a membership of well over 500,000, makes us the largest socialist party in Europe. I think that's something to be very, very proud of. And for those that say we're not developing enough on policy, we put out a 10-point plan, a 10-point idea. They're open for development, they're open for consultation. And we've had thousands and thousands of emails in reply, sometimes in criticism, sometimes suggesting changes or improvements, but above all, there is a level of interaction and involvement. So we start with rights at work. That's why we've set up Workplace 2020, which is looking at the rights at work of people struggling to survive on 0 hours contracts, struggling to survive in unorganised and often quite dangerous working environments. If anybody thinks this is all, well, a bit unnecessary in modern Britain, I urge them to look at 2 companies, or 3 actually. Look at BHS, look at Sport Direct, and look at Deliveroo, for examples of appalling employment practices. And then you will see the need to end the iniquity of 0 hours contracts. Then you will see the need for full recognition of trade union rights. Then you will see the need for a living wage that means that people can survive on it. We don't have a living wage in Britain at the moment. We do have towards 1 million people on 0 hours contracts. We have many, many more whose stress in life, real stress in life, is that their inadequate, insecure, often unpredictable wages don't provide them with the money they need to pay the rent, to feed their children, or to live anything like a normal life. What we have is growing inequality in Britain, with greater concentrations of wealth at the top end and burgeoning poverty at the other end. Not right, not necessary, it has to be challenged. Nowhere is crisis that faces Britain at the present time. I represent a constituency not so far away from here, and the heartbreaking problems of housing, of a private rented sector, some of which is very badly managed and very badly maintained, all of which is quite expensive, means that those on any kind of average or below average income then face a benefit cap, which means they cannot remain in the relatively high-cost areas of London. They're then forced to move. And because they're on 6 months assured short-hold tenancies, they might be moving every 6 months. What does it do to a child growing up knowing they don't really have a home? They have a place for 6 months. They might go into a hostel for a few months. They might go into a short stay somewhere else. They might have moved schools so many times. Talk to a child who's changed primary schools 4 or 5 times before the age of 8 and ask them what they feel about security of life. And then our government tells us that all that matters is local authorities in high-value areas, most of which, but not all, are in London and the South East, must sell off valuable council housing when it becomes vacant through death or somebody legitimately moving on. And then, at the same time, saying that those that do relatively well have got to pay to stay and end the whole concept of lifetime tenancies. Can't we do something a bit different and a bit bolder and recognise that the post-war housing crisis was dealt with by a government that was bold enough to build council housing and build it again? And at the same time, regulate the private rented sector. And it seems that regulation of the private rented sector is a bit of a problem for the Tories. And so when one of our Labour MPs, Theresa Pearce, proposed an amendment to the housing bill, which was actually so short and moderate, I thought it was going to go through unopposed. All it said was, any property put out for rent on the open market should be fit for human habitation. It's not a big ask, is it? It's pretty simple, and the definition of human habitation is also fairly predictable and quite easy to understand. Too much for them. No, 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 no. They voted that one down. That is the kind of government you're dealing with. That is the kind of opposition we're dealing with, and that's why we have got to get on the front foot and say to everybody, we will invest in the housing that's needed. We will regulate the private rented sector. We will other policies we have. Other speakers have mentioned the value of our National Health Service. I just want to say a couple of things about our NHS. It was the single greatest achievement of our party